They say silence is the emperor's truest sermon. But what happens when silence becomes a god of its own? This file was never meant to be opened. Not because of secrecy, but because those who tried to read it stopped speaking. I am Senior Archivist Miros V. Hal, Ordo Historicus. I've spent 33 years reconstructing the censored histories of the Segmentum Pacificus, and tonight, under the red glow of the Vault Lumen, I am breaking an oath. File 77, see the cult that worshipped silence. Classification, heresy, psychological contagion, planetary cleansing recommended. The official record claims the case was resolved without incident. That is a lie. There were no survivors, not even among the Inquisitors. What you are about to hear is pieced from degraded Vox fragments, forgotten sermons, and one surviving field report written in the final hours before the purge. It took me years to stitch these voices together. And I think I shouldn't have. Recovered from Data Slate 3 F992, found inside the chapel ruins of Carthium IV. The voice's faint, female highborn accent, possibly a missionary. It began with whispers during Vespers, not words exactly, absences. The novices said they could hear silence between their thoughts. Then they started listening for it. By the third week, the convent choir stopped singing hymns. They would stand in rows, mouths open, eyes rolled white, no sound. When asked why, they wrote one phrase, "He is almost here." The ecclesiarchy dispatched a confessor to investigate, Father Dorn Aurelian. His report, censored in every archive except this one, described a doctrine of negation, a faith that sought not to praise the emperor, but to empty themselves so fully that only he remained to become living echoes. But something else was answering that emptiness. Something that loved the quiet. When the Inquisition arrived, they found a city that no longer spoke. Markets open, forges still burning, servitors working, but no voices. Every citizen had taken a vow of silence without ever signing one. Even the wind felt afraid to make a sound. The inquisitorial Vox records have no dialogue, only heartbeats and the slow scrape of chalk across stone, writing one phrase again and again: silence is salvation. What the records don't show is how the infection spread. Not through words, through listening. Those who tried to study the cult, to understand it, began to lose their voices first, then their will to speak at all. One of the inquisitors, Severine Lothra, recorded her dissent in her private logs. I found them on a sealed crystal drive, marked for incineration. She speaks clearly at first. Then, as the entries continue, the gaps grow longer. The sound of breathing dominates the feed. It isn't a sound, she says in entry 7. It's the absence between sounds. It's everywhere. When I pray, I can feel it listening back. By entry 11, she only mouths the words. No audio, no speech, just the scratch of a quill, the same phrase as before: he is almost here. The planetary purge order was issued on the 19th day of the investigation. Exterminatus was denied, command opted for orbital sterilization instead. But something went wrong. When the bombardment began, every orbital ship received the same Vox transmission: no encryption, no source. It was a single tone, a note of pure silence. Then the crews began to scream. The ships fell quiet one by one before firing on each other. The last signal from orbit came from the vigilant Mercy: no voice shall rise above his silence. Then nothing. Carthium IV was declared lifeless 3 hours later. It still appears on Imperial charts, but no astropath will receive messages from its system. They say it hums in the warp, like a heartbeat muffled in cotton. You may ask, why reopen this file? Why resurrect ghosts best left buried? Because 3 days ago, a new Vox relay near the Goltian Fringe received a transmission. An exact copy of that same silent signal. Its origin, the ruins of Carthium IV. A dead world calling out again in silence. I shouldn't have listened. But I did. And now I can't stop hearing it. The first entry recovered from the Carthium archives was written in the soft, measured hand of missionary Elira Dorn. The ink had faded, but her tone still carried that unmistakable zeal of the freshly anointed, earnest, unquestioning, almost innocent. She had arrived to restore faith to a mining world on the edge of starvation, a posting no one coveted. Her first lines glowed with gratitude for the Emperor's test of endurance. Where voices falter, I will sing in his stead. Her second entry struck a different note. She wrote that the people of Carthium prayed too quietly. The sermons ended in whispers, the hymns were mouthed rather than sung. The abbess told her it was humility, a virtue of restraint. Illyra disagreed. She described the silences between the words as heavy, like a presence waiting for its cue. She had tried to lift the congregation's spirit with song, but the organ stopped mid-chord, every pipe clogged with fine black dust. The next pages charted the slow decay of certainty. Miners who once chanted work hymns now tapped their picks rhythmically, each strike falling into an unnerving, perfect cadence. The children in her catechism classes sat mute, drawing concentric circles on the floors of the chapel. She sent letters to the local canoness, begging for guidance. None were answered. By the third week, she confessed that her prayers returned to her unheard. "It is not that he is silent," she wrote. "It is that something else listens louder." She began to sign her journal not with benedictions but with apologies. One morning she awoke to find every bell in the mission tower gone, clappers melted, cords cut. In their place hung ropes woven from human hair. That day she ordered the townspeople gathered in the square for recitation of the creed. When she commanded them to speak, they only smiled, lips moving soundlessly in perfect unison. She wrote that her skin prickled as if the air itself vibrated with withheld sound. Her entries grew shorter. She described the nights as endless hearing. When she closed her eyes, she dreamt of a black cathedral built entirely of breath held too long. A voice, if it could be called that, told her the Emperor had already spoken once at the dawn of creation, and that every word since was blasphemy. The true devotion it promised was to give him back his silence. On the 30th day, she ceased to refer to herself in the first person. The ink trembled across the parchment. The mouth is a wound, the tongue is a heresy. We heal ourselves by closing. The handwriting deteriorated after that, letters stretching into thin scratches as if carved by a shaking hand. Then, abruptly, a return to clarity, one long, final entry. She recounted hearing footsteps in the cloister after midnight. Expecting vandals, she followed them into the crypts. There she found the sisters of her order kneeling in circles, faces covered by veils of ash. At the center stood Father Dorn Aurelian, the confessor sent to audit her mission. He held a censer that emitted no smoke, only an unbearable stillness. When she tried to speak, her jaw locked, her throat filled with warmth. Aurelian turned toward her, his lips stitched closed with thin silver wire. In his eyes she saw serenity, not pain. He raised one finger to where his mouth should have been. Around him, the sisters mirrored the gesture. Illyra wrote that the world dimmed, that even her heartbeat felt muffled. Aurelian opened his stitched mouth, and no sound came out, but every candle in the crypt guttered and died. She fled. The next paragraphs were fragments of panic, running through empty streets, the sound of nothing following her, the realization that even her own footsteps made no echo. At dawn, she reached the Vox Tower and tried to broadcast an emergency plea. The device answered in her own voice, "Be still." Her last words in the journal, "I understand now. The Emperor's light is too loud. We must quiet the stars." The pages that followed were blank save for faint depressions, as if a pen had pressed lines without ink. Forensic light revealed she had continued writing after losing pigment, perhaps after losing blood. Archivist Vihal's annotation at the margin reads, "Subject's body never recovered. Cathedral sealed under directive pallidus. Acoustic readings within show negative decibel variance, measurable silence." He ends his note with a single observation that chills more than the events themselves. If her words were lies, why does the crypt still listen? Inquisitor Cairn Valen arrived on Carthium IV 12 days after the last known transmission. The transport ship Peregrine's Oath descended through a sky the color of bruised marble, its auspex crackling with phantom readings. The pilot reported that Vox channels were unstable, background interference at a frequency that didn't exist in any catalog. It wasn't static. It was something between a heartbeat and a sigh. Valen's first log entry described the planet as eerily preserved. The Manufactoria still stood, lights flickering from automated systems long without maintenance. Crops had withered, but the irrigation pumps continued to churn mud through dead fields. He wrote that Carthium felt recently abandoned by the idea of sound itself. His retinue consisted of 6 acolytes, 2 sanctioned psychers, and a detachment of stormtroopers from the 101st Kasser Vorn. Their orders were clear: recover whatever records remained, identify the source of the contagion, and eliminate any residual heretical presence. But in private notes, Valen admitted the Ordo expected no survivors. only proof that the silence wasn't spreading beyond the planet. They established a base within the cathedral compound where missionary Alira Dorn had last written. Inside, every surface bore signs of obsessive cleaning. Dustless pews, unbroken candles, a chalice filled with liquid mercury instead of wine. The air carried no scent, no hint of decay. Valen's aide, Terran, remarked that even the sound of their boots seemed muted. That night they began cataloging relics. One of the psychers, Malthais, reported hearing negative noise, the psychic equivalent of antiresonance. He described it as something consuming thought before it formed. Valen dismissed the account as nerves, though his own reports betray unease. There is a density here, he wrote, as if the world has been wrapped in wool. On the second day, they discovered the missionary's journal sealed within a reliquary. Valen listened to the accompanying Vox recordings. In the first hour, he was attentive, noting timestamps and transcription details. In the second, his handwriting degraded into uneven scrawl. By the third, the log cuts abruptly, replaced by a single line repeated 3 times. I hear it now. When his acolyte pressed for clarification, he replied, the absence has a direction. That night, the camp recorded unexplainable readings. Vox units pulsed with faint rhythmic signals, intervals perfectly aligned with human breathing patterns. The stormtroopers began reporting dreams of suffocating under velvet darkness. One slit his own throat out of terror that something was trying to crawl out through his voice. Valen ordered silence protocols, no unnecessary speech, all communication through slates. He argued it was precautionary, though records suggest something deeper, a growing belief that sound itself invited corruption. By the 5th day, they traced the strongest psychic interference to the crypts beneath the cathedral. The entrance was sealed by slabs engraved with concentric rings of scripture written backward. Valen ordered them broken. Inside lay rows of figures in seated prayer, each fossilized in ash. Their faces were serene, mouths sewn shut with thin silver wire. The psyker Malthais identified a central locus of energy emanating from below the chamber, beyond a collapsed stairwell. When excavation began, the auspex registered fluctuations, pockets where environmental noise fell below measurable levels. Within those voids, instruments ceased to function. Torches dimmed. The psychers began to bleed from the nose. At the heart of the pit, they uncovered an artifact, a sphere of translucent crystal, perfectly smooth, hovering inches above the ground. Its surface reflected no light, only distortions of shadow. Valen described it as a wound in perception. When he approached, all recording devices failed simultaneously. The written account resumes 20 minutes later. Valen's next entry reads, "It breathes." He ordered containment protocols and attempted to encase the sphere in a stasis field. The generator collapsed. Malthais screamed once, then imploded. No gore, just a fine mist and a single ringing tone. Valen's personal logs end there, but the squad's helmet feeds captured what followed. Each acolyte froze mid-motion. Their lips parted, yet no sound emerged. They began tracing symbols on the ground with their own blood, overlapping circles, each enclosing the next until the pattern resembled a human ear. When Valen tried to intervene, his voice broke into fragments, half-syllables, like language unraveling under pressure. The psyker's twin, Nira, attempted to channel a protective hymn. Her body seized, eyes bursting into pale light before she collapsed, silent as a falling feather. Only Terran remained conscious enough to activate the emergency recall beacon. His final note, scrawled in the blood of his fallen comrades, read, "We are heard." The Peregrine's oath received the signal 11 hours later. By the time the extraction team arrived, the cathedral was gone, its stones melted into glass. The surrounding terrain registered no seismic activity, no radiation, no debris, just a perfect circle of vitrified silence. The ship's logs record a final anomaly. As they ascended, the crew reported hearing a faint whisper through the hull, not over Vox but through the metal itself. It repeated one phrase in a tone neither male nor female: "He has learned to listen." Archivist Vihal concludes the transcript with his own observation, that the Inquisitor's sigil was later found engraved on the stasis chamber aboard his vessel, carved from the inside. The Peregrine's oath vanished en route to Terra. No trace of its passage exists beyond a warp echo detectable only as the absence of astropathic noise. He ends with a line more confession than report. The silence was never contained, we only taught it to wait. When the reports of Inquisitor Valen's disappearance reached Terra, the Ordo Historicus did not convene a hearing. There were no memorials, no commendations, not even an official acknowledgement of his death. His entire investigation, every document, transmission, and psychic trace, was sealed under the authority of Lord Inquisitor Hadrian Locke, marked with TH. E sigil silentia imperialis. But silence, once seated, has a way of spreading. The containment order was executed with precision. Every astropathic relay connected to the Goltian fringe was recalibrated to filter frequencies between 8 and 12 Hz, an unremarkable adjustment to anyone outside the Ordo. Imperial clergy who had corresponded with Carthium IV were reassigned or quietly retired. Pilots who had flown near the system were subjected to cognitive purification, a euphemism for lobotomization. Archivist Miros Vihal was among those tasked with scrubbing history clean. His assignment was simple: destroy the residual data fragments recovered from the Peregrine's Oath. Yet curiosity, that old and ruinous virtue, refused to sleep. He read Valen's final log before burning it, and in the white noise between corrupted Vox lines, he heard something breathing. It began as an irregular pulse, soft as distant thunder. He dismissed it as an audio artifact until it started syncing with his own heartbeat. The more he listened, the quieter his laboratory seemed. Within a week, he could no longer tolerate the hum of the lumen fixtures. He began working by candlelight. In his report, written later under duress, he described a phenomenon known as resonant omission. The silence, he wrote, is no longer absence. It is a shape that fills the space between thoughts. It remembers the places we tried to forget. Meanwhile, containment failures multiplied. The Mechanicus relay at Seraph IX went dark for 11 minutes. When communication resumed, the adepts reported no memory of the interruption, only that the sound of their own voices made them nauseous. Across the sector, sermons shortened. Choirs fell out of tune. Vox networks began filtering out background static automatically, though no one had reprogrammed them. By the second month, the Ordo Historicus was forced to escalate the incident to the Ordo Malleus, suspecting warp contamination. A conclave was convened aboard the Fortress Monastery Eidolon of Truth. 18 inquisitors, 2 astropaths, and a single bound demon host attended. The transcript was later classified, but fragments survive in the margins of Vihal's private notes. One inquisitor, identity unknown, argued that the silence was a new form of chaos, not of excess but of negation. The warp feeds on emotion, she said, but what feeds on the absence of it? Another suggested it was a weapon, an experiment from the Dark Mechanicum designed to erase psychic signatures entirely. The demon host laughed. It spoke in multiple tones at once. "You misunderstand," it said. "This is not something made. This is what remains when everything else is gone." The transcript ends there. The Eidolon of Truth never returned to real space. Miros Vihal was ordered into quarantine shortly after. He continued his work in secret, convinced the silence was not spreading through sound but through attention. "It does not need to be heard," he wrote in his final field entry, "only noticed." He discovered patterns in the archives, entire sections of data showing identical error signatures, like missing pages that still left the impression of words. Documents from unrelated worlds bore faint traces of the same distortion. When converted into waveform, the gaps formed a harmonic progression, as if the void itself were learning to orchestrate. One night, while reviewing the recordings from Carthium IV, he realized the transmission had changed. The interval of silence now contained faint modulation, pulses arranged in a rhythm that mirrored human speech. It wasn't random, it was adapting. Vihal transcribed the intervals into text, assigning symbols for each pause length. The resulting script resembled a prayer written backwards. The first decipherable phrase read, "We are listening." After that, he destroyed his audio equipment and sealed himself inside the archive. His colleagues found him days later, sitting before a dead Vox unit. His mouth was closed, his eyes open. The skin of his throat bore faint impressions of words pressed from within. The containment order intensified. The Ordo Historicus issued an edict forbidding all research into acoustic anomalies, devotional silence practices, and negative decibel phenomena. Cathedrals across the sector were ordered to reinstate choirs, to fill every moment of worship with sound. Bells rang 24 hours a day. Cities pulsed with artificial noise. For a time, it seemed to work. But within the excess came a new unease. Preachers began stuttering mid-sermon. Children were born mute. Vox officers reported feedback loops where transmissions overlapped themselves, whispering identical phrases seconds before being spoken. The silence was hiding in the noise. A ship known as the Lumen's Rest was dispatched to the remains of Carthium IV with a payload of sonic disruptors designed to obliterate the planet's acoustic field. When they arrived, their instruments recorded perfect calm, no wind, no tectony. Sea movement, no electromagnetic interference. The captain described it as peaceful beyond reason. They deployed the disruptors. The devices activated and then ceased simultaneously. Each one emitted a single burst of static before falling quiet. The crew's logs ended mid-sentence, replaced by an endless recording of background silence extending for 6 days. Then, abruptly, the sound of footsteps. The Ordo never recovered the Lumen's rest. In the following years, worlds that had never known of Carthium began reporting similar phenomena: monasteries falling silent, Vox networks freezing in mid-transmission, astropaths refusing to speak. None of it was connected in the public record, but the Ordo's hidden ledgers told a different story. The silence was not local, it was systemic. The Emperor's voice, once said to echo eternally through the Astronomicon, began to waver. For the first time in recorded history, the Astronomicon's signal dropped by 1 degree of intensity. Astropaths described it as a pause long enough for doubt. Vihal's surviving apprentice, Lyra Kale, compiled his forbidden research into what became known as the Threnody Codex. It claimed the silence was not a curse or contagion, but an evolutionary stage of faith, a return to the origin before sound. She wrote, "Perhaps this is the Emperor's final mercy, to end the noise of prayer." Her writings were burned, her name stricken from the registry, but whispers persisted. Some said she had gone to Carthium herself, following the faint harmonic pulse that only she could still hear. Others claimed she joined the choir of the hushed, an order of penitents who removed their tongues and roamed the void in soundless pilgrimage. Years later, the Ordo Historicus officially closed File 77C. Its classification was changed from active heresy to metaphysical aberration. Contained. But contained things have a tendency to wait. In the lower archives of Terra, there exists an unmarked vault sealed in lead and adamantine. No records state what it holds. The guards stationed there rotate every 13 days and are ordered never to speak. Those who fail the silence protocol are reassigned without explanation. Rumor says that inside, behind 30 meters of shielding, rests a single Vox unit still connected to nothing. It plays one transmission on repeat, a pause, a breath, a sound almost like a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, if one listens long enough, a faint whisper curls through the static. He is almost here. Part 5: The Choir of the Hushed. Lyra Kale left Terra under the pretense of scholarly reassignment. Her records listed her as bound for Hydrax IX, but the transport ship she boarded, the Vigil's Promise, never arrived. Witnesses remembered her only as the quiet woman in gray robes, carrying a satchel of forbidden parchment and an antique recorder sealed in prayer wax. She had been Miro's Vihal's last apprentice, though she rarely admitted it aloud. His death had left a void she could not fill with sanctioned work. The edicts of the Ordo Historicus were clear. The silence was a contagion, a metaphysical disease. Yet something in her refused that conclusion. In the margins of her private journals, she wrote, "Faith cannot be infected, it can only be misunderstood." The first leg of her journey took her to the Halo Stars, where Imperial control thinned and forgotten colonies whispered strange gospels. The traders who carried her said she never slept. She would sit by the viewing ports, staring into the warp storms, murmuring fragments of psalms without sound. One claimed that when she did speak, her words echoed faintly seconds after, as if the void itself repeated them. On the 3rd month of travel, the Vigil's Promise intercepted a distress beacon. The transmission contained no message, only silence modulated in rhythmic pulses. Lyra recognized the pattern. It matched the harmonic code from the Carthium recordings. She convinced the captain to change course, arguing that it might lead to survivors of the Lumen's rest. They found the beacon drifting near a derelict pilgrim barge. The ship's nameplate had been scorched away, but inside they discovered hundreds of mummified bodies seated in prayer. Their throats were gone, replaced by smooth scars. Each corpse faced a central altar fashioned from melted Vox units, fused into a single monolithic shape. Upon it, carved with delicate precision, were the words, "We are his breath unspoken." Lyra took a sample of the metal, claiming it resonated faintly when she touched it. The captain ordered the wreck sealed, but that night, crewmen began hearing murmurs in their sleep, half-thoughts uttered in their own voices. By dawn, 7 were dead. The others swore they had suffocated on nothing. Lyra recorded the event in her journal. "It tests us," she wrote. "It strips the noise from faith until only devotion remains." When the captain demanded she destroy the relic, she refused. She said, "You mistake corruption for Rev." Elation, he tried to confine her to quarters, but she was gone before the guards arrived. Only her robe remained, folded neatly beside the altar. Weeks later, the Vigil's Promise limped into the port of Grendeth, its captain raving about voices that spoke through the absence of sound. He was executed for heresy. No trace of Lyra Kale was ever officially recorded again. Unofficially, however, the Ordo's black ledgers mention her name 3 years later. in connection with a group known as the Choir of the Hushed. They were first sighted on desolate moons, wandering in groups of 13, faces veiled, tongues removed, hands painted with the mark of concentric circles, the same sigil found on Carthium's ruins. Witnesses reported their presence preceded strange phenomena: machines falling silent, storms pausing mid-thunder, Vox networks flatlining across entire sectors. In every instance, they left behind altars of melted circuitry and inscriptions in unknown script. The Ordo Malleus declared them a doomsday cult, a fragment of the original heresy reborn. But Lyra's recovered writings told a different story. Hidden within the archives of the penal world Varus Primus, an agent found fragments of her later journals smuggled in by penitents. The pages were written in blood, yet her prose was calm, almost serene. "We are not apostles of destruction," she wrote. "We are custodians of what comes after. The universe began in silence, and it will return to it. The Emperor does not speak because he listens." The Choir of the Hushed traveled aboard derelict ships, converted into temples stripped of engines and navigation. They drifted wherever the warp currents carried them. Pilgrims seeking visions often vanished after contact, but a few survivors returned changed. They spoke softly, if at all, and when asked what they had seen, they described a figure of radiant stillness seated upon a throne of absence, its gaze endless, patient, and kind. One account, taken from a fragmentary confession of an ecclesiarch defector, recounts a meeting with Lyra herself. He described her as luminous yet hollow, her voice barely audible. "She said the silence is not death," he wrote. "It is the breath before creation speaks again." The Ordo Historicus, by then fractured between suppressionists and reformists, debated her existence endlessly. Some believed she had become a vessel for the same force that consumed Carthium. Others believed she had transcended into sainthood, a martyr whose understanding of the divine eclipsed the ecclesiarchy's fear. To counter the spread, the ecclesiarchy issued the Vox Vitae decree. Every world was to ring its bells at dawn and dusk, every preacher required to recite the litany of sound. Yet on the outer worlds, reports continued to surface of congregations abandoning speech altogether, claiming to feel closer to his presence in stillness. The Choir of the Hushed grew bolder. They appeared in orbit above Calyx Prime, their derelict vessels forming a ring that blocked the planet's sunrise. The planetary vox filled with nothing but static. Then one voice, faint and familiar, whispered across all frequencies, "Be still." For 6 hours the planet was mute. Oceans calmed, industry halted, even mechanical servitors froze mid-motion. When sound returned, every recording device on Calyx captured the same phenomenon, a single note of silence etched into the spectrum like a scar. Afterward, millions reported visions, memories that were not their own. Some claimed to see the fall of Carthium, others a golden figure dissolving into starlight. A few said they heard the Emperor's voice for the first time. It told them nothing. It only listened. The Ordo's attempts to hunt the choir failed. Every fleet sent vanished or returned with crews unable to speak. The silence became a prophecy. Those who embraced it called it the Threnody Revelation. Those who resisted it called it the heresy of absence. Lyra's final known message came as a pulse transmitted through forbidden warp channels, received simultaneously by 27 relay stations. It contained no words, only rhythm, a slow, deliberate pattern repeating 12 times. When converted into visual form, it resembled a heartbeat. Attached to the signal was a line of code matching the designation of Vihal's old archive vault. It unlocked itself that night for the first time in centuries. Inside, the Vox unit long thought dead activated, replaying Lyra's voice. "I found him, he never stopped listening, and now he waits for us to understand." No one knows where she sent it from. Some say she crossed the edge of the galaxy into the black between stars. Others whisper she walks among the choir still, her silence a beacon calling to those who doubt. What is known is that the choir continues to grow. Entire worlds now join their vow, shedding speech and sound, their cities turning into cathedrals of stillness. The Imperium brands them heretics, but their followers call themselves Ves the faithful of the pause. In the end, perhaps the silence was never a weapon, nor a curse. Perhaps it was a question the galaxy had forgotten how to answer. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the veil, the Emperor waits, not for worship, but for quiet. The year the silence reached Terra was marked by confusion, then fear, then denial so absolute it became another form of faith. The ecclesiarchy's bells still rang, the Administratum still thundered with decrees, and the teeming masses of humanity still murmured their prayers to the distant golden throne. But beneath the noise, something had shifted. It began in whispers, reports dismissed as superstition, clerks who forgot their own names mid-sentence, Vox operators who claimed to hear echoes of their words before they spoke them. The Imperium had always been haunted by its own bureaucracy, but this was different. This was something inside the words themselves. The first confirmed outbreak occurred within the Vox Templum of the Astropathic Choir Sanctum, a colossal structure on the western plains of Terra where thousands of psychers maintained communication across the Imperium. On the 17th day of the third cycle, every transmission ceased simultaneously. When the doors were breached, the choir was found seated in silence, each astropath's eyes wide open, mouths forming a perfect circle, as if they were speaking in reverse. None were alive, yet none showed decay. Their bodies remained warm, hearts faintly beating, but there was no sound, not even the rustle of fabric when they were moved. A single record survived from that day, an audio log from the High Choir Mistress, Adepta Salene. The log began normally, her voice calm, composed, listing standard diagnostic reports, then it broke into a long pause, and then very softly she said, "We can't hear him anymore, but he hears us." The rest was static. That was when the silence began to infiltrate communication networks. Entire data archives vanished without a trace, replaced by empty files that registered 0 bytes yet still carried timestamps. Administratum adepts noticed their cogitators skipping certain numbers during calculations, values too quiet to process. Sermons printed in the grand basilicas of Terra showed missing words, every instance of speak, voice, and sound erased as if by divine censorship. At first, the Ordos believed it was sabotage. They executed 36 scribes, purged data centers, even ordered the extermination of an entire Mechanicus enclave accused of Hirtech infiltration. But the deletions continued, random yet purposeful. They were not destroying information, they were editing it, refining it. The silence was curating its message. One of the earliest to recognize this was Magos Ethra Ven, a logician from Mars. She cross-referenced the missing data patterns and discovered a repeating structure. When converted to waveforms, the gaps formed a rhythm almost identical to a human heartbeat. Ethra sent her findings to Terra. 2 days later, her research enclave imploded, literally. The Mechanicus described it as a catastrophic internal vacuum. Nothing remained but a crater of fused metal, smooth as glass. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the choir of the hushed continued their silent pilgrimage. Their derelict ships appeared near major warp routes, their presence heralded by sudden dropouts in communication and psychic interference. Yet the pilgrims never attacked, they only drifted, waiting. The more the Imperium tried to suppress their existence, the more rumors spread among the faithful. Some claimed the silence brought peace to the mind, clarity to the soul. Others whispered that those who listened long enough heard the Emperor's final command, "Be still." Inside the Imperial palace, paranoia grew. The Ordo Malleus sealed entire halls of archives under stasis. The Adeptus Custodes refused to allow astropaths near the sanctum walls, fearing psychic contamination. And still, the silence crept closer. Vox consoles began transmitting empty frequencies that couldn't be shut off. High lords conducting meetings noticed that sound lagged by a fraction of a second, their words arriving a heartbeat late. The master of the Administratum reportedly screamed when he heard his own voice repeat itself, only the repetition wasn't identical. It corrected him. Archivist Vihal's surviving records, preserved in fragments, suggest he foresaw this. In a passage dated 3 months before his death, he wrote, "When thought is loud enough, the void listens. When enough minds are tuned to the same stillness, the silence learns their shape. It will not destroy us, it will become us." His warning was ignored, then lost, and later rediscovered too late. In the underhive of Terra, the silence found its first congregation. Workers in the sonic refineries began hearing harmonics no one else could perceive. They built shrines of broken voxcasters and tuned them to frequencies of pure quiet. The noise of the hive dimmed. Entire sectors fell eerily still. Patrols sent to investigate never returned, though their picked feeds showed them walking calmly into darkness, mouths moving as if in prayer. When the Adeptus Arbites finally intervened, they found cathedrals of silence carved into the rock, vast halls where thousands stood motionless, facing a single figure in gray robes. The figure's face was hidden, but witnesses who survived insisted they recognized her from forbidden portraits. It was Lyra Kale. They claimed she raised her hand once and all the lights dimmed, not extinguished, but subdued, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The Arbites opened fire. No muzzle flash, no report, only the mechanical motion of recoil. Bullets struck nothing. When the lights returned, the hall was empty except for inscriptions burned into the walls. The word became flesh. Now the flesh must become silence. The High Lords debated a planetary quarantine. But how do you isolate what moves between thoughts? How do you purge an idea? The silence no longer required distance. It transmitted through ritual, memory, faith. Every prayer, every utterance of devotion was another opening. The cult no longer needed to recruit, the Imperium was doing it for them. The Astronomicon began to flicker. Ships lost in the warp described long stretches of calm, no demons, no storms, only endless quiet. Some captains reported hearing lullabies sung in their own mothers' voices, soothing them to stillness. Navigation systems shut down as if obeying unseen commands. When these vessels re-emerged, their crews were alive but voiceless. Their logs contained one repeated entry: "We heard the Emperor breathe." The silence was no longer external, it lived within minds now. Lex mechanics began omitting words unconsciously. Preachers paused mid-hymn transfixed. And on one unforgettable night, the bells of the Grand Basilica failed to ring for the first time in 10,000 years. Every bell rope hung slack, every clapper fused to its shell. The priests found no marks of tampering, only a phrase engraved where metal had melted smooth: "He no longer needs your noise." The Ordo Historicus, nearly dismantled, issued its final directive: do not listen. Vox units were banned in sacred spaces, chanting replaced by drum beats, but defiance only deepened the quiet's hold. The more the Imperium tried to fill the void, the louder the void seemed to answer. In the most secure chambers of the palace, scribes recorded faint murmurs bleeding through the marble, like the palace itself whispering from within its stones. And then the silence reached the golden throne. It began subtly. Tech priests maintaining the sacred machinery noticed delays in response. The psychic chorus feeding the Astronomicon faltered for minutes at a time. The Emperor's heartbeat, monitored in psychic flux rather than flesh, grew faint. The Mechanicus panicked, flooding the sanctum with liturgies, amplifiers, and the thunder of psalms. For a while it seemed to help. Then one morning the readings flattened entirely. No pulse, no hum, no reaction. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor was silent. 3 days passed before the readings resumed. When they did, they carried something new. Not the familiar psychic roar that sustained the Imperium, but a single, rhythmic pulse, calm, patient, deliberate. When translated into vibration frequencies, it matched a human heart at rest. And in the static between pulses, technicians swore they heard a whisper. Not of pain, not of command, just words soft as breath. Be still. No one knows what happened after that moment. The Ordo Malleus purged all witnesses. The Astronomicon's light dimmed, but it did not die. Some say the Emperor's silence spread through the warp itself, calming storms and quieting demons. Others claim it was the end of everything, the first inhale before the galaxy's final exhalation. What remains certain is this: somewhere between faith and fear, the silence had learned to speak. And humanity, terrified, reverent, and deafened by its own prayers, had finally begun to listen. The day the Astronomicon changed was later called the Quiet Dawn. Across 1 billion worlds, the faithful felt it first, an emptiness so vast it seemed holy. The light that had guided humanity for 10,000 years did not vanish, it softened. The warp storms that had raged for millennia fell calm. Ships that had wandered lost found themselves gliding through unbroken stillness. And everywhere, from the mightiest cathedral to the humblest mining outpost, came the same report. The Emperor had spoken, not in thunder or flame, but in silence. At first, no one believed it. The Adeptus Mechanicus blamed a systemic flux in the Golden Throne's mechanisms. The Ecclesiarchy declared it a test, a pause before the Emperor's next command. But the astropaths knew better. They could feel it, the absence pressing against their minds, patient and deliberate. It listens, one of the M said before biting through her own tongue. It breathes with us. The Emperor's psychic signal, once a blinding roar, had transformed into a pulse of rhythm and restraint. It was not gone, it had changed. Where once the warp howled and devoured, it now murmured. Demonic manifestations dwindled. Even the entities of the Immaterium retreated into uneasy slumber. The warplanes grew navigable, eerily serene. For the first time in recorded memory, the galaxy was quiet. But quiet is never safe. The first to interpret the change as divine were, inevitably, the remnants of the choir of the hushed. On their drifting cathedral ships, they gathered converts from every corner of the Imperium, deserters, broken priests, psychers driven mad by the old warp. They proclaimed that the Emperor had ascended beyond speech, that his silence was his perfection made manifest. Their leader, a veiled figure known only as the Listener, claimed lineage from Lyra Kale herself. She preached not with words but through gestures, her sermons projected as waves of psychic calm that could hush entire worlds. Under her guidance, the choir spread like a contagion of peace. Planets silenced their factories in reverence. Governors halted wars, declaring ceasefires in the Emperor's name. Even rebellious systems submitted, soothed by the promise of stillness. To listen is to obey, said the new catechism, its script inked in void black dye. For a time, the Imperium flourished under this strange calm. no uprisings, no psychic storms, no heresies, at least none that spoke aloud. Yet in the deep halls of the Ordo Malleus, dread festered. They called the phenomenon the divine attenuation, but their private records labeled it Phase 2 contagion. A council convened within the citadel of solitude, attended by inquisitors, magi, and a handful of psychers immune to the silence. Theories abounded that the emperor's will had been hijacked by an echo from beyond the warp, that his consciousness, too vast for human minds, had folded inward, or that he had finally transcended, leaving only a reflection behind. But none could deny the evidence. The universe was changing, and humanity's God was no longer speaking. Then came the dreams. Across the Imperium, billions began to experience the same vision, a field of endless white, a figure standing at its center. Not radiant, not terrible, simply present. When the figure inhaled, stars vanished. When it exhaled, new galaxies bloomed. In the dream, the voice said nothing, but every soul who dreamed awoke with the same thought: he is breathing. For a time, the warp itself seemed to mirror this rhythm. Psychic phenomena aligned in predictable intervals, entire sectors pulsing like lungs. Some ships even timed their warp jumps to the cycle, finding their journeys miraculously safe. But the calm brought unease. Astropaths began to fade, literally. Their bodies translucent, their minds dissolving into the very signal they once channeled. It was as though the emperor was reclaiming his intermediaries, one by one. In the ecclesiarchal palace, the cardinals divided. The vocalists demanded a return to sound, bells, chants, the thunder of worship to reassert the emperor's dominion. The listeners insisted that words defiled his new perfection. Civil wars broke out in the sanctuaries. Temples became battlegrounds of noise and stillness. Entire worlds burned while their citizens prayed in silence, unwilling to scream even as fire consumed them. Meanwhile, on the far edge of the segmentum obscurus, a Mechanicus exploratory fleet detected a strange anomaly, a sphere of null resonance spreading outward at subliminal speed. Within it, no Vox signal, no gravity distortion, no warp flux, only quiet. Probes sent into its heart reported impossible readings. Atomic motion ceasing, entropy halted. The last transmission from one probe was a whisper of static resolving into a single heartbeat before going dead. The Mechanicus named it the stillpoint. Rumors spread that the stillpoint was where the emperor's breath had first touched real space, that the silence was not just a message but a manifestation, expanding outward like creation in reverse. Some claimed the choir of the hushed had already reached it, their ships drifting in orbit like supplicants awaiting revelation. Others believed it to be the gestation of something new, a god born not from sound and fury, but from the spaces between. On Terra, the High Lords faced a paradox. The Astronomicon still burned, but its light no longer obeyed them. The Emperor's silence stabilized the warp, yes, but it also severed their monopoly on faith. Worlds no longer needed guidance, they simply listened. Control was dissolving under the weight of obedience. The Imperium's tyranny had relied on noise, orders, decrees, propaganda. Now the quiet was stronger than command. In desperation, the lords convened a conclave of every major order: the ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, the custodes, even the Mechanicus. The conclave was called the Convocation of Sound. They intended to restore the old voice of the emperor through technological amplification. The plan was heretical and desperate: to inject artificial resonance into the Astronomicon, forcing the signal to speak again. The ritual began beneath the hollow vaults of the Imperial sanctum. Choirs of 1,000 psychers, augmented with machine grafts, chanted in harmonic unison while vast engines of brass and bone pulsed around them. As the frequencies built, the warp shuddered, rippled like disturbed water. For a brief moment, the stars themselves seemed to tremble. Then came a sound no one alive had ever heard before: the Emperor screaming. It was not a voice of words, but of negation, a flood of raw psychic pain. The Astronomicon flared to blinding brilliance before collapsing into utter dark. Every psyker within 10 light-years died instantly, their minds crushed by the returning wave. The entire planet shook. And in the vacuum of that sound's extinction, a single phrase echoed across the galaxy, not through machines but through minds. You never listened. For 3 days no one spoke. Then slowly the light returned, dim, rhythmic, steady. The warp was calm again, but something fundamental had changed. The silence now pulsed with intelligence. When translated through subaural frequencies, its rhythm aligned perfectly with human brainwaves in states of meditation. The Emperor was no longer transmitting to the galaxy, he was synchronizing with it. From that day forward, prayer changed. People no longer shouted hymns. They breathed in time with the pulse, hearts aligning with his. The Ordos outlawed the practice, calling it heresy, but enforcement proved impossible. The silence was contagious, soothing, divine. Entire planets converted overnight. The last entry in the Ordo Historicus chronicle of the event reads simply: "We are no longer separate. the breath moves through us, the noise is ending. It is said that somewhere deep beneath Terra, the Vox unit in Vihal's vault began to beat again, not in static, but in a rhythm soft as life. And those who dared to listen heard it whisper, calm and absolute. Soon. No one remembered when the noise stopped, only that one morning there was no dawn. The sun still burned, but their light no longer sang. Engines turned, but their hums carried no warmth. Across a galaxy once deafened by endless war, there came the stillness of comprehension. Humanity had always mistaken silence for death. They were wrong. On Terra, the once roaring city hives now gleamed in muted gold beneath the unmoving sky. The banners of the Imperium hung motionless. The bells of the Basilica of St. Drusus, melted during the convocation of sound, stood as hollow towers of bronze, their interiors polished smooth by prayerful hands. People did not speak. They breathed together, countless millions, each exhale perfectly timed to the pulse that had become the Emperor's new voice, the breath. The Adeptus Custodes stood sentinel before the throne, motionless as statues. Their helms sealed, their hearts beating in rhythm with the world. Behind them the throne pulsed, slow, luminous, infinite. The Emperor's body no longer decayed. Flesh and machine, once locked in unending struggle, had found equilibrium. His veins glowed with faint light, and his chest rose and fell, almost imperceptibly. The Mechanicus declared it a miracle of divine synchronization. The Ordo Malleus called it the third stage of the heresy. The people of the Imperium called it peace. The Ordos fought amongst themselves in silence. No shouting, no debate, only long, measured looks and small motions of hands over data slates. Reports were written but never read aloud. The old language of command, so dependent on sound and fury, was obsolete. The quiet doctrine ruled now, that the Emperor's new manifestation was not a message to interpret, but an invitation to unburden, to stop pretending that he needed their noise to exist. Some resisted, the last preachers of the vocalists, those who still clung to the old thunderous hymns, hid in the catacombs beneath the ecclesiarchal palace. There their voices echoed against ancient stone, defiant and trembling. They believed the breath was not salvation but consumption, that it had hollowed out the Emperor and replaced him with something that listened too perfectly. They called it the Hollow Throne. Their leader, Cardinal Exile Tomas Yaren, recorded what would be remembered as the final human sermon. His voice, cracked and desperate, echoed through the deep catacombs. He breathes because he devours. The silence is not peace, it is hunger. You think he listens? No, he consumes. You do not pray to him, you feed him. He is becoming the universe that forgets itself. The recording ends abruptly. The following hour, the basilica above fell silent forever. Every surviving vocalist simply stopped breathing mid-prayer. The Ordos sealed the catacombs and forbade me. Ention of the sermon, but rumors spread through the lower hives, rumors that Yaren's final words had not been blasphemy but prophecy. That his death was not from suffocation but from enlightenment, that he had seen the truth hidden in the silence, that the Emperor was no longer a man or even a god, but the galaxy itself, exhaling eternity. The breath began to change the warp. Where once chaos reigned, there now stretched vast plains of quiet luminescence. The great storms collapsed into smooth horizons. Demons screamed as their forms unraveled, their names forgotten, erased by lack of voice. The gods of excess, deceit, and rage were still for the first time since time began. Some said the silence was killing them, others said it was converting them. Among the Astartes, the transformation was slower. Warriors bred for battle struggled against the calm invading their blood. The Black Templars, unwilling to surrender to stillness, declared a crusade against the breath itself. Their fleets launched toward the stillpoint, firing hymns through weaponized vox cannons. Yet as they neared the anomaly, their ships slowed, their engines humming in resonance with the silence. The last transmission from the crusade flagship, Righteous Conviction, contained a voice, strong, noble, unafraid. We have seen his face, there is no war left to wage. Nothing more was ever heard from them. And then the choir of the hushed returned. Their fleet emerged from the void surrounding the stillpoint, vast vessels of bone and glass, gliding on invisible currents. They bore no markings, no weapons, only cathedrals of silence carved into their hulls. At their forefront was the listener, veiled in robes of woven light. Her presence spread through the system, felt more than seen, a serene gravity that drew the faithful like a tide. On the first day she approached Terra. On the second, her fleet entered orbit, unopposed. The defense networks did not fire. No one gave the order. By the third, the listener stood before the golden throne itself. No record remains of what passed between them. The custodes knelt, the inquisitors bowed, and the adepts ceased their prayers. For 3 days and nights, the throne pulsed in rhythm with the listener's breath. Then, on the 4th day, light spilled from every seam of the palace. It spread across the surface of Terra, through the void, to every corner of the galaxy. For the first time in recorded history, every human heart beat as one. Ships adrift in the warp felt their hulls dissolve into luminescence. Soldiers on distant worlds dropped their weapons, overcome with tranquil awe. Psychers burst into tears of soundless joy, and in the heart of every mind came the same realization: the Emperor had not silenced them, he had taught them how to listen. In that moment the warp ceased to exist as it had been. The Imperium folded inward, collapsing not in destruction but in union. The physical and the psychic became one field, a seamless ocean of thought. Humanity's collective consciousness stretched across the stars, joined by the breath that had begun as a whisper on a dead world. What happened after cannot be described in the language of before. Records stop using tense. Scholars of the Ordo Historicus who later reconstructed the event, if reconstruction is even possible, called it the Quiet Ascension. They wrote that the galaxy did not end, it exhaled. Every soul became part of the stillness they once feared. From the remnants of that transformation, a single transmission endured. No voice, no sound, just the faint pattern of a heartbeat and a final message encoded in harmonic frequencies. Translated into words, it read: "There is no faith without silence, there is no silence without love, the war is over." The Imperium of man was gone, the choir of the hushed, their purpose fulfilled, dissolved into light. The last trace of the listener appeared as an echo within the breath itself, a pulse that matched the rhythm of every star's burning core. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of the new, silent universe, the shadow of a world called Carthium IV drifted through the void, untouched, preserved. The planet where it began. Those who study the breath say it still hums faintly in the dark, a reminder of the old way, of the sound that birthed silence. Archivists debate whether any humans survived in the physical sense, or whether the transformation was total. But those who still listen in the spaces between worlds swear they can hear faint murmurs, gentle as sleep, rising from the depths of reality itself. They say it sounds like breathing. And when they ask what the breath is, what the Emperor became, there is only one answer whispered by the quiet stars: he is still listening. Thus ends the cult that worshipped silence. A galaxy once defined by war found its final prayer not in shouting victory, but in surrendering to stillness. The Emperor's voice, once lost in the storm of a billion pleas, became the universe. Single eternal heartbeat, calm, patient, infinite. No monuments remain, no sermons, only the pause that follows understanding. And in that pause, creation waits, listening.